Okay, so I think, as is often the case with a lot of us, I had one of those moments this morning where I was getting in the shower and then I had this weird lightning bolt idea. And I wanted to record it because I know otherwise I'm going to forget my thought process. And really, I kind of wanted to share it because I wanted to hear people's thoughts on it and people's ideas so that I can kind of work together to make this idea good. And this idea came out of the fact that while D&D campaign that I run is going really well, and I think it's probably going to last quite a long time, I know that at some point I'm going to want to run another campaign, and I'm going to want to improve on things that I think could have been better this time around. Okay, and I think that means that the next time I run a D&D campaign, it's going to be in a different campaign game world. Right. And I began thinking, okay, well, what would that campaign game world look like? How do I want to make that game world unique and interesting, but put it in a way where it makes sense to my players and they're able to understand it and enjoy it rather than just being confused and perplexed by my bizarre ideas? And I started thinking, because I've been watching a lot of Clone Wars the last sort of 6 months, and kind of got into Star Wars a lot more than I have been for the last lifetime. I thought to myself, well, could you set a game world in space, a Dungeons and Dragons game that's set in space, and still preserve sort of the integrity of the rules and have things like a barbarian running around with an axe? Does that make sense in a campaign world that's set in space where you've got sort of people going around in spaceships? And I thought about it and I was like, yeah, you could find a way to make that work. I know that people have done it before, but I'm not a huge fan. I'm not that into the idea of high technology settings like spaceships and laser pistols and blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm not that attracted to that. That's not really what I like about Star Wars. And I think more than that, also the idea of like infinite vacuum of space and etc., and like the idea that in order to travel through space you need a spaceship because you can't survive otherwise. I'm not too into that idea. But the thing that I like about stories that are set in space is the idea of, this sounds really weird, 3D geography. Okay, on an ordinary world, most D&D campaign settings, your game world is a flat plane, right? Even if you've got a sphere, a planet, right? All of your countries, cities, towns, everything is on a flat surface, and sort of things are between one another. And you might get the instances where you've got people who live underground, and very rarely you might have sort of the citadel in the sky, which gives you that 3D geography. It's not really the same as having planets that are arrayed sort of around one another or around a star or something like that, and being able to have those things interact with one another in a way that creates a lot of variety, right? Let's say that you're on this planet. Well, you can go a very short distance to any number of nearby places and get a lot of variety by going to those places, and having those distinct planets can create a lot of different variety in cultures and geography, very almost at a moment's notice, right? You can go, you know what would be really fun? We could do like a volcano-based adventure, and there's a volcano, and now you just go to the nearby volcano planet, right? And that idea is no longer crazy because you're working with 3D geography. I really like that variety that you get from having access to that kind of game world. But I didn't want to do space. So how do I get that without doing space? This was my thought process, and all of this took about 2 minutes for me to figure out, way less time than it's taken me to explain it. But here's the idea that came to my head, right? Imagine that you have a planet, right, that is a sphere, an orb, normal sort of planet, and then something happens to that planet where it gets broken up into pieces, right? Some cataclysmic event, some kind of sundering that takes the planet and splits it into multiple different pieces. Okay, so now rather than having one planet, you've got all these individual shards of various different sizes. Some of them are really, really small. Some of them are really, really large. Okay, but the planet, in its new fragmented form, these pieces are still close enough together, and some of them are still large enough that it maintains a decent amount of gravity. And the result of that gravity is that you still have an atmosphere. Okay, you still have an atmosphere, and these shards still have enough gravity themselves that people can live on them. Okay, they can still sustain life. I'm just going to change the colour of this because, well, you know what I'm like. Let's go blue. Okay, in fact, no, let's go slightly grayer because this is the atmosphere. Okay. And so because of this, you wind the clock forward sort of at least 10,000 years after this cataclysmic event, so that a status quo is established, right? Things sort of stabilize, and whatever survivors there were of the sundering of this cataclysm, they now have their own societies again with cities and politics and interaction between different nations, right? And each of these shards effectively becomes like a continent. Okay. And as per usual, I want an arrow, please. I want an arrow. There we go. So each of these is effectively like its own continent. Except the result of having things like this is that you have this sort of 3D geography where you can interact with anything, and there's a load of different, completely different biomes nearby, right? You can go to different shards that are, one is like volcanoes and fire, and one of them is sort of a bunch of individual rocks that are broken up into small pieces, and you can kind of move around between them, almost like its own little microcosm. And you can go to a place that has like rivers and seas and that kind of thing. And all these things are all sort of close to one another, close enough that you can move between them, because there is this there's this continual atmosphere between everything. So there's no point that you can move to in this system where you can't breathe. You can breathe everywhere. If you go away from the main shards, you'll get to the point where it's a bit like being at the top of the Himalayas, where the air is really thin. But you can survive, at least for a limited amount of time, and you have people who live there permanently, and they are like the communities that live very high up in the mountains in the real world. I don't know what it is, but I'm just kind of attracted to this strange idea. So this place is habitable, and the all of the shards are habitable, and they're all completely different. And one of the ideas that really kind of struck me as being firstly kind of crucial, but also really interesting, was the idea that what happens to this water supply that was on the original planet? Well, firstly, you can have on the shards, you can have sort of small seas and lakes, right? Rivers, streams, places where people can actually get water. But also, you can have larger bodies of water that flow between the shards, sort of caught in the gravity, and they might kind of go off a waterfall on one shard and then just kind of float to another shard, pulled by the gravity from that shard, right? And this creates, effectively, waterways that allow for travel, okay? While also providing all kinds of other opportunities, right? Like, you could have, if you imagine you have a waterway that goes from a big shard to a little shard to another little shard to another big shard, you could have sort of a community of pirates who live on the little shard, and they prey on people who are trying to travel between the big shards. Okay? You get all of these cool ideas for storytelling. And also, what happens if these shards are all orbiting around one another? Well, maybe sometimes some of the shards are closer to one another than they are at other points. Maybe it goes through cycles, like in a year, right? And what difference does that make on politics and on geography and on trade, and what kind of storytelling comes out of this? Okay, so you get all these kind of bizarre ideas that are created by the complex and wonderful geography of this world. I guess the next thing that you need to solve is, well, what do you do about a light source? What do you do about a heat source? Do you still have the original sun from when it was an ordinary planet? Okay, does that provide a heat and light source? And does this system of shards rotate around the sun in much the same way a normal planet would? I think that would probably be the simplest idea, which is pretty cool. Another idea that I thought of was, well, what if the planet's original core now becomes effectively like its sun, right? It is both a heat and a light source, and then these individual shards are much more like conventional planets going around a sun in itself, and maybe that core is almost like the source of magic, right? In some way, who knows why? Who cares? It could just be an interesting idea. But I think this can still work, but one of the ideas that I like is that being able to travel between the shards is sort of a big part of the reason why this would be a cool idea. And so having something in the middle that stops you being able to travel between the shards as easily kind of detracts from that. So maybe I'm not as keen on that idea, but the idea that the planet's core is important in some way, I think that is a cool idea, and that's worth experimenting with. The idea that all of the shards are like geographically unique, I think, is one of the main reasons why I think this is cool. The fact that you can just jump between different shards, and that gives rise to very different stories, and the players get to explore loads of different really cool things almost at a moment's notice. And it, I don't know, it just gives rise to a lot of ideas. What else have I got in my notes here? You can have completely different cultures on different shards. So if one of your players rocks up and they're like, oh yeah, I want to play, I want to be a Yuan-Ti barbarian, and my ancestors are like really important to me. I'm like, well, for me as the game designer, I haven't really planned for the idea that like Yuan-Ti could be good guys, or even that there were Yuan-Ti. But hey, maybe you live on a really remote shard, and now it's possible, right? You can have this culture that the player has come up with, and it makes perfect sense. They just live on a small shard somewhere where this unique society is developed. And in a similar vein, if you're a year into the campaign, you're like, oh, I've suddenly come up with this idea for a society of robots, and they're warforged, right? Bam, there's just another small shard somewhere where these people exist, and your players can go and visit that place. And these sort of silos, these individually isolated places, can be completely unique in bizarre and wonderful ways. You can kind of throw those in at a moment's notice. The last thing I think that makes the game world sort of has a lot of opportunity for storytelling is the idea of the transport and the travel between different shards. Like traveling on these waterways, what adventures do you get from that? Like maybe you're traveling on a waterway and disaster strikes, and now you're stuck in the middle of nowhere, and maybe your ship, whatever a ship is in this game world, that travels along these waterways, maybe it is like a boat, right? Maybe it's not like a boat. Maybe it is more like a spaceship, but more magical, and maybe it doesn't have to be constructed of metal, right? It doesn't have to be airtight, so it can be wood, but it can look like a spaceship, like a wooden spaceship. That's a cool idea. But maybe these things are powered by like elemental magic, right? Like if you want to travel along this waterway, maybe the power source for this boat, which is effectively like a spaceship, maybe the power source is a water elemental, right? And that's what gives you the power to direct where you're going. And maybe as you travel along one of these waterways, it changes direction, so you can sort of go halfway along and then you can veer off and go somewhere else, right? Who knows? And that way, having the ability to steer becomes incredibly important. And so you can have like cool technology that's mostly magic based, really, and you can still have that, I don't know, wooden aesthetic rather than things being made out of metal and being kind of cold. I don't know. It's kind of crazy. I think you have to kind of balance that with the idea of teleportation magic, right? Which isn't as interesting, but would certainly come into play if you've got magic like teleportation circle, which high-level arcane casters can use. You can teleport sort of from one shard to another, right? Presumably this is for the elite more than it is for common folk, because that's a sort of a scarce commodity, depending on how easy it is to become a powerful spellcaster. And even then, teleportation circle can only transport a limited number of people, and you can only do it a certain number of times per day, so using spell slots, I mean. So something to be considered. But yes, this kind of crazy idea came to me this morning, and I wanted to record my thoughts, mostly for my own benefit, but also to share them so that I can get feedback, and if other people have got ideas that they want to pitch in, if they think this is cool, or if they think this is dumb, or if you have any other input that you want to offer, then yeah, feel free to throw it my way. I'd love to hear your thoughts. There we go. I think that's everything I want to talk about.